So welcome, folks. Today we're going to be talking with Tim Sherratt, who is just quite newly of Tasmania in Australia and about the GLAM Workbench and web archives. And he's going to provide us an overview of some of the tools that he's been building and bundling together. And we're actually quite excited. Tim, I'm not sure if you know Nicholas Warby from University of Toronto, but he recommended that we reach out to you because he saw a webinar that you were showcase some of the tools. So we're really looking forward to seeing what you have to show us today. I'd just like to first of all acknowledge that where I'm coming from out here in Victoria is the traditional and unceded territory of the Lekwungen peoples, on whose land the university stands. And I always like to take an opportunity during these territorial acknowledgements just to have everyone reflect on where they are and their relationship with the land and Indigenous communities that are there, as well as we move towards reconciliation and in Canada. This webinar today that Tim has been so gracious in offering us as part of the QueryPic webinar series that we have established as of last fall. And we have about one of these a month. So you can tune into the QueryPic listserv or the Carl website to find out when those happen. Our next one will be January 26th with Ian Milligan and Samantha Fritz of the Archives Unleashed research project, overviewing a lot of the work that they're doing. So we're very excited to have them. You'll see lots of details come out again through the Carl website or via the QueryPic list. But enough about the future. Let's talk about the present here. And Tim, welcome and thank you again so much for joining us. Tim is an historian and hacker who researches the possibilities and politics of digital culture collections. And this really interests me because the University of Victoria has a strong tradition of digital humanities, and folks that work in this domain with these types of tools are quite rare sometimes during these conversations. So he's been doing this for a long time, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what Tim has to say. So Tim, I'll turn it over to you, and what folks can use the chat to ask questions, and Tim's going to be watching the chat window. He'll answer things as he goes along, or we'll deal with things at the end during the discussion period. So Tim, thanks again, and over to you.
Thanks, Corey. Hi, everybody. Yes, hi from Hobart in Tasmania, just about as far away as you can get from where you are, I suppose. And thanks for having me along to talk today about the GLAM Workbench, and particularly some stuff that I've been developing around web archives this year. The slides for today are here, and I will, just while I'm looking at this, grab this and stick it in the chat. So you're welcome to follow along with the slides and share the slides as well. So they'll be up after today, and they have links through to everything. So feel free to hand that around and explore further after today. Yes, what I'm talking about today is this thing called the GLAM Workbench, which I suppose is a bit of a passion project for me. It brings together a lot of stuff that I've been doing over the years. And I suppose what I'm trying to do with the GLAM Workbench is, well, you know how it is. Libraries, archives, museums, more and more they're making their stuff available online, and often now in machine readable forms, so through APIs or data dumps or collections of text or images. All this great stuff which is out there or becoming available. But the question is, how do we get people in there using it, exploring it, seeing what the possibilities are? Starting to see collections in different types of ways. That's the real challenge. And I think it's a challenge on sort of two fronts, really. First of all, there's, the how questions, like, okay, you've got an API, but how do I use it? How do I make a request for it? What's there? How do I get it? There's the digital skills questions. How do we make sure that people have the skills, the knowledge, the tools that enable them to work with this data? But as well as the how questions, there's the sort of why questions. Why should they invest the time finding out about your API? Why should they download this huge data dump that you've made available? And both of those, I think, are important if we're going to get people in there working with collection data. And so the GLAM Workbench is sort of my attempt to try and fill some of those gaps. It's, it would be wrong for me to say that it's been meticulously planned and strategized and worked out over time. It's really just a whole lot of stuff that I've chucked in together. So it's a mix of tools and tutorials, examples and hacks. So it's not like it's a big sort of tutorial where you start at one point and you work your way through and you get to the other point and all of a sudden you know everything about collection data. There are some things which are sort of quite detailed tutorials, walking you through step by step how to access a particular API and how to make different types of queries from it. In other cases, there will just be like quick hacks, just sort of to work around to get stuff out of a web interface or something like that. Sometimes there's sort of, bits of code. Often what will happen is if I'm doing something or somebody asks me how you do something with a particular collection, I'll document that and I'll make it available. So that if somebody else has the same question, is trying to do the same sort of thing, it's there. So they do range from sort of, as I say, sort of more detailed tutorials through to just sort of example bits of code that you can drop into your own projects. So all that, and I think that diversity is useful because it means you can sort of meet people at different places in their own sort of journeys in developing skills and learning about collection data. So if somebody's just starting off having a tutorial or having a simple web app, and there are some of those in the GLAM Workbench as well, which just does something useful, can be a useful place to start. On the other end, if you're an experienced coder and you're just sort of trying to get your head around yet another API, which is different to everybody else's API, just having some quick examples that you can make use of and drop into your project can be useful. So having that diversity sort of enables you to meet different audiences and enables people to sort of thread their own pathways through the material from something which just starts them off so they get an understanding of what's there, to the point where they're actually starting to do their own coding and pull stuff together. As we'll see, the examples, the tools, everything in the GLAM Workbench, you can run as live code within the Workbench. And that's possible because of these things called Jupyter Notebooks, which I'll talk about in a minute. All of the bits of the GLAM Workbench are editable, reusable, hackable. They're all available on GitHub. They're all openly licensed. So they're also preserved in Zenodo. So it's all there to be reused. So it's not meant as a sort of standalone thing. It's meant for people to take stuff and use whatever way they want, whatever way is useful for them. I should just perhaps say, so at the moment, the GLAM Workbench is mostly focused around Australia and New Zealand because it does reflect my own research interests. So there are sections for Trove and Digital New Zealand and things like that. There's also some government data from the Australian government. But I'm mainly talking today about the Web Archive section. But even stuff which is related to Australia, there some interesting useful examples which could be employed against other APIs or other data sources. So there is some stuff which is generally useful, even though the focus is on Australia and New Zealand. As I said, the Workbench makes use of these things called Jupyter Notebooks. Jupyter Notebooks are really cool. You may have heard of them. They are becoming more popular in a range of contexts. They are particularly heavily used within data science, for example. But you're seeing now a number of libraries and archives making Jupyter Notebooks available. So, I mean, ones I know of, that's like the British Library and National Library of Scotland. National Library of Estonia, I was talking to recently, is doing some work, Library of Congress. So, you know, there's a range of institutions now which are realizing the possibilities of Jupyter Notebooks to get people to engage with their collection data. And the reason why they're good at that is that they combine text and live code. It constructs a sort of, I've heard it called a literate programming or a computational narrative. The idea that you can actually have the bits of code embedded within some sort of narrative where you can describe what you're doing, actually give real live examples along the way. And all of this happens within your browser. So Jupyter Notebooks run within your normal web browser. And as you can see, you can set things up so that you have a computing environment within the cloud, within which your notebook opens. So effectively, you can just click on a link and start doing real stuff. The thing I really love about Jupyter Notebooks is that combination of both tool and tutorial. So it's not like having, okay, here's your tutorial over here. Here's how you learn how to code, work through all this, and then come back and you can do some stuff with our data. It's more like, okay, let's dive in. Let's do an API request right here and see what happens. Let's see the sort of data we get back. Let's explore and unpack this a bit more, look at the data fields. Okay, that's interesting. Let's try this and give another live example. So you can actually, like I said, develop that sort of narrative. And it means that people can be doing real stuff from the start. So it's not, it's not having to learn things first. It's learning as you're doing. So you have that opportunity to have real live practical examples all the way through so that people can see the possibilities early on. Again, those why questions can be pushed to the front because people can get that sort of instant feedback, that understanding of what happens when they make that API request, what happens when they analyze that CSV file. So it pushes those sorts of possibilities to the front, which I think is really useful and exciting in these sorts of contexts. So this is sort of what a Jupyter Notebook looks like. Like I said, combining text with code. The code lives in these little boxes. If it's a live notebook running, I said, in a sort of computing environment, it's all you have to do is to actually get that code running is where there's a code box, a code cell with a sort of border around it. You click on the code cell and you hit Shift Enter, and that runs that code. So like I say, it's running live in your browser. So Shift Enter. If you're using Jupyter Notebooks, you're doing that a lot. You're hitting Shift Enter a lot. If you want, you can edit any of the code cells. So it's not just a matter of running what's there. Any of them can be edited. So in editing is just, again, a case of clicking on the code cell, changing something, hitting Shift Enter again to run that cell. We'll see some live examples of this later on. But, that really is the basics of using Jupyter Notebooks, is clicking on cells, hitting Shift Enter. That enables you to run that code live and see what's actually going on. Okay, so as I said, the GLAM Workbench now has a web archive section as of about June this year. This was thanks to the IIPC and their discretionary funding program. So I applied with the British Library, with Andy Jackson at the British Library, and we got a little grant which enabled us to develop a set of notebooks using web archives, which are now in the web archive section of the GLAM Workbench. And there's links there to information about the project. The aims of that project were really to provide effectively a starting point for researchers who are interested in making use of web archives, who want to sort of go beyond just using web archives to find dead links, to start to ask different sorts of questions on it, but don't really know where to start. You know, they might not necessarily imagine themselves as digital researchers. They don't want to necessarily grapple with both the possibilities and the challenges of scale, which emerge when you're working with web archives. You know, they might want to ask the sorts of questions of web archives that they would ask of any historical source. You know, what is the context of this document? Where does it come from? How does it change over time? Those sorts of questions. So those were the sorts of questions that we wanted to focus on. Those sorts of, you know, fundamental basic questions. If somebody was starting to make use of a web archive, how could they explore those sorts of things? We wanted to make it, again, sort of accessible. So making use of existing APIs, so using Memento Protocol and CDX APIs where they're available, rather than expecting people to download lots of data in order to start doing something. So use data in small chunks, basically, I suppose, and build up from there. No special tools. So basically, again, sort of building everything around the Jupyter Notebook so people can just dive in and start using stuff, not having to, you know, have specialized computing resources in order to make it happen. And great to hear that you're going to have Ian Milligan talking about Archives Unleashed at your next session. I mean, this project was very much intended to complement Archives Unleashed, or projects like an Archives Unleashed, which do grapple with those, you know, challenges and possibilities of scale, you know, doing things across large collections. So, you know, I'm sort of hoping that things like our sort of modest little project will get people thinking about those sort of possibilities, those sort of questions that they can ask, and give them a bit of a pathway so that they can, once they've sort of used the tools and the possibilities within the GLAM Workbench, go on to something like Archives Unleashed and see, you know, what opens up when you start to use those sorts of tools. So within the GLAM Workbench, you'll see this is a notebook, one of the notebooks that's listed within the Web Archives section. So if you click on there, you'll see there's all these notebooks here. So I just wanted to point out here a couple of things. So first of all, this bit here, which says that that notebook has been created to work with those particular repositories. So in that case, it's the Australian Web Archive, the New Zealand Web Archive, the Internet Archive, and the UK Web Archive. And the partners for the project with the IIPC were the Australian Web Archive at the National Library of Australia, the New Zealand Web Archive at the National Library of New Zealand, the UK Web Archive, and we also made use of the Internet Archive data as well, because of course it's so readily accessible. So we worked in developing these notebooks, we worked specifically with those repositories, but however, because, you know, web archives tend to use a sort of standard set of software, because they do tend to build in Memento compliance into their systems, the Memento protocol, it means that the notebooks in here can be adapted quite easily to work with other web archives. So if they're, you know, a PyWeb system or an OpenWayback system, they basically can just be plugged into the notebooks, and they can be used in the same sort of examples. So while they do at the moment just work with these set of repositories, you know, I hope people will take them and start to modify them to make them work with different systems. Another thing to note, where it's got the notebooks listed here, is that there are a series of links underneath each notebook. These first couple of links are static views of the notebook. So you can see the notebook, you can see the code, you can see the text, but you can't actually run the code. It's just a static view. And then you can view it either on GitHub or a thing called NB Viewer, which is provided by the Jupyter project. Gives a slightly nicer rendering than GitHub. So they're just views to see what the notebook looks like. So a quick look to see what's going on, great. But if you actually want to run the notebook, to actually do stuff with the code, you can click on this link down the bottom here, which says Run Live on Binder. If you do that, so click on the link like that, it opens up this service called Binder. Now, Binder is a research project developed in Europe, sort of added on to the Jupyter project, and its aim is really to support the idea of reproducible research, so that you could have a research paper, for example, you might have some code associated with that, that paper, but having code's one thing, but having the computing environment in which to run that code and reproduce those results is something a bit more complicated. So Binder enables you to basically define a computing environment and have your notebook, your code run within that environment. What happens in terms of the GLAM Workbench is that each of the sections of the GLAM Workbench is a GitHub repository. Within that GitHub repository, there's a configuration file. So when you click on that link, Binder goes to GitHub, it reads that configuration file, it builds the computing environment that you want based on that configuration file. So that file will list all of the Python packages that need to be installed to run the things in that notebook. So Binder builds all that, makes the computing environment available, then sends you to it and opens up the notebook within that environment. If that repository has been previously built, the image for that environment will already exist. So it doesn't have to sort of do everything from scratch, it just loads it up. Even so, it can take a little while to start up. So click on the link, you may be waiting sort of 30 seconds or so for that to actually happen. But it's doing all sorts of stuff. It's building this computing environment for you. Just start working. So just be patient and it will start up. So it's a great service for something like this because it enables people to just dive in and start exploring, right, with the GLAM Workbench. They don't have to do anything special. They just click on the link, the notebook opens, they can start running code. They can start doing stuff. They can start exploring. Again, it's about lowering those barriers for entry and helping people explore those why questions. What happens when I do this? There are, however, some limits to Binder. So if you leave your notebook alone and go away and do something, it closes. So the computing environment itself sort of stops responding. Any data that you might produce or harvest are not saved. So you need to specifically download things to your own computer if you want to keep them. And the notebooks in the Web Archive section and most of the GLAM Workbench, in fact, where they are harvesting data or pulling data together, they have a cell which enables you to package stuff up and download it as well, just to make that a bit easier and more obvious. So there are, obviously if you're, like I say, Binder is fantastic for getting in there, doing stuff quickly and exploring. And even though, I have these notebooks sitting on my own computer and I have all the, libraries and everything installed, oftentimes, it's just easier to click on the Binder link and start doing stuff rather than actually find things on my own computer. So, really handy for encouraging people to have a go. But if you want to do some, development yourself, if you're harvesting lots of data, that's when you start to think about setting up your own computing environments, setting up Python, and installing all the software that you need. So that's the sort of pathway that you would start to go down. Explore things with Binder, see what's possible. Then eventually you're going to get to the point where you want to install things yourself. And there's some information about that in the GLAM Workbench as well. Okay, so let's get on to the notebooks themselves. So there are a few themes within the Web Archive section of the GLAM Workbench. It's looking at the different types of data you can get from web archives. It's looking at harvesting that data and creating data sets and exploring specifically those questions about change over time. So types of data. So this is sort of background information in a way, I suppose, in that, you know, researchers are probably not going to go here first. They're more likely just to want to start doing things. But I found, you know, even though we're working with systems which embed certain standards and protocols, so Memento, for example, I found when I actually started exploring them that there were some variations in the way these things were implemented. So I did spend, you know, quite a bit of time just documenting stuff from the different repositories. You know, I learned a huge amount in doing this project in terms of the data that's available and the richness of it and how actually easy it is to get at it. But, you know, there are some hurdles and a lot of this stuff is not terribly well documented. So, you know, I thought it was worthwhile actually just trying to document some of that stuff as I was going through, even though it's not the most thrilling of notebooks to work with. Yeah, so looking at the sort of Memento implementation across the different repositories. So that's time gates. So, you know, you're web archives people, I'm assuming you know all about time gates and time maps and mementos and stuff. So time gates, you know, you fire a date at the web archive and you get the capture back that's closest to that date effectively. Time maps, you give a URL and you get back a list of the captures of that URL. The CDX API, so PyWeb has a sort of CDX API by default, and the Internet Archive has a really sort of rich, useful CDX API. CDX API, so that's, you know, the index of all the captures. So they're useful for doing different sorts of things. But, you know, again, they're all slightly different. So the Internet Archive CDX API is different to the PyWeb one. The PyWeb ones depend on sort of local implementation as to what they do or don't do. So all that sort of stuff. Anyway, so it's all, I've tried to document everything that I found there in live working examples. So the Memento example just goes through and fires a series of requests to the different repositories, you know, to see what you actually get back and sort of compare that to what you sort of expected to get back. And having done that, you know, it finds that there are some variations there. So it then provides a bit of code to sort of smooth out the bumps between the systems. So that you can just sort of fire a request at any of the repositories and get back something in a form that you would expect. So it just, as I say, tries to smooth over some of those sort of bumps. So this section documents those differences, provides a bit of code to sort of smooth over the differences so that in later sections, it just makes use of that bit of code to query all the repositories without thinking too much about those differences. Okay, so as I said, having found how those systems work, those different APIs, the sorts of data that's there, and smoothed over some of the bumps to provide some sort of regular ways of accessing them, then we move into examples of that. So the first notebook there, get the archive version of the page closest to a particular date. So that's basically just, you know, Memento. It's just using a time gate. Again, that sort of standardized version that I've got, which works across the different repositories. Similarly, find all archive versions of a web page is using the time map to get all the information about all the captures. So they're just different examples of how those sorts of requests that you can make. Where things start to get more interesting is this sort of one. So harvesting collections of text from archived web pages. So not just finding out what captures are there, but actually extracting information from all those captures and putting them into a form that you might like to analyze in different types of ways. So in this case, pulling all the text out of a collection of web pages that you could then feed to the sort of text analysis program of your choice to look for different patterns or, you know, again, change over time. And we can actually see that notebook. Make that a bit bigger. So this, again, is an example of a Jupyter Notebook. We've got text up here, which is explaining what's going on, talking about the type of data, the type of requests that we're making. And here's where the code starts. So the packages that we're using, this is defining the repositories that we're accessing, the URLs that we need for those. These are the functions which sort of, standardize things and enable us to do stuff. So let's just start running this. So what this notebook is doing, like I said, it's going to, first of all, get a collection of captures of a page or a series of pages, and then it's going to extract the text from those pages. So it actually, you have an option here to get all of the text within a web page. So that includes sort of navigation and menus and all that sort of stuff as well, or just the sort of meaningful text. And to get at that, it uses a Python library called Trafalatura, which has a sort of series of algorithms which it uses to try and determine, what's the significant text. So what's not menus and navigation, things like that. It seems to work pretty well. So I'm just hitting Shift Enter. So like I said, Shift Enter, just hitting Shift Enter on these cells to make them run. So here's examples where you might save all the text from a particular web page, from all the captures of a particular web page to see how that page changes over time. Those examples use the time maps to get the list of captures and then harvest the text from those captures. You could feed it a list of websites or a single website URL. I'm going to run this one though. This one's slightly different. So this uses a CDX API from the Internet Archive and enables us to do a bit more sort of filtering. So in this case, we're going to look for things. So this is the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in Australia, the government department. This in the context of CDX API is a, what is it? It's not a domain query filter. It's, I can't remember the name. Anyway, prefix query. So it's saying that we want everything, look at everything under dfat.gov.au. So for URLs under dfat.gov.au. The CDX API, the Internet Archive CDX API, enables us to do some nifty stuff in terms of applying filters to the index entries. So this bit here, original, so original refers to the actual harvested URL. And we can apply some filters to that. So in this case, this is a regular expression, which is basically saying we want any URL which includes the word policy in it. I mean, this is obviously the URL. It's not the text that we're searching here. It's just the URL, but that can be quite useful. So anything under dfat.gov.au, which has the word policy in the URL, status code. So we want successful harvests, and we only want HTML files. We don't want JavaScript or images or anything like that. So we can just run that. And first of all, it's going to get a list of all the captures first of all. So this is sort of operating in 2 dimensions, right? Because it's getting, first of all, it's getting a list of all the matching URLs. So all of those URLs in that domain that have policy in the URL. And then once it's got all of those, it's going to get all of the captures of that URL over time. So sort of 2 dimensions, both the different URLs and those URLs over time. So the first stage, what it's doing here is actually just getting those URLs back. And once it's done that, we'll just wait it to start doing the next bit so you can see. It's going to start getting those individual captures and saving the text from those files. So, so this is one URL that it's harvesting here. And it's, actually, I'll go up. I'll just show you the one that it's finished. So this one, So this is the text file that it has, the text that is extracted from that web page. There's only one capture of this particular page, but it's captured the text, and it creates a little metadata file for each URL, which has the information about the URL when it was captured and lists all the mementos, so all the captures of that particular URL. So you can create your own data set. It could be quite a complex, large data set of text files which cover a domain. Like I said, you can pull those text files together and start to sort of analyze them in the text analysis program of your choice. So I'll just leave that run away for a little bit, keep going for a little bit. So that's one example of harvesting a data set, creating your own data set from a web archive. Like I say, using little chunks of data rather than starting from a big sort of CWAC file or something like that. Another example, okay, so that's the harvesting text. This is another example which is in the GLAM Workbench, which gives a sort of example of a more complex workflow, I suppose. So in this case, it's also using the CDX API from the Internet Archive to find all the PowerPoint files which exist within the defence domain, the Australian defence domain, defence.gov.au. Having found all the PowerPoint files, it downloads all the PowerPoint files, it converts them to PDFs, it grabs the first page of the PDF as a thumbnail, it extracts the text from the PDF, and then it pulls it all together in a little SQLite database and uses a package called dataset to explore it. So it shows how you can go from a sort of query of a domain and actually create something which enables you to explore it in depth. I've just clicked on the link to the sort of SQLite database. I've got a free version sort of running on Glitch, which is a software hosting platform. It takes a little while to wake up. I'll just leave it for a minute, but once it's there, you can actually start to sort of look at what you've harvested there and start to explore it. So it's got a sort of full text search built into it. So having pulled the text out of all those PDFs, then you can search the full text of them. It's got all the thumbnails and the metadata and things like that that you can start to explore. So again, starting from the web archive, pulling out some data and then starting to analyze it in different types of ways. Another example of harvesting. So, most of the stuff, working with relatively small chunks, I thought I'd have a go at doing something a bit bigger. So I tried to find all of the unique subdomains which sat under gov.au, again, using the Internet Archive's CDX API. So I basically tried to get out all of the unique URLs sitting under gov.au. And it ended up with about 62 gigabytes of data, and then played around with that to try and get the unique domains out of that. It was all possible. Again, no sort of special equipment. I was working just, normal computer. You probably wouldn't want to do that on Binder because, it's just too much data to work with in that context. But I just wanted to show that it is possible to scale these sorts of examples up if you want to. Oh, that little thing is loaded there. So this is the PowerPoint files from the Australian Department of Defence. There we are. So these are the thumbnails which have been saved from the PowerPoint files. I think they look fascinating. We do have a full text search thing up there as well, so we can start to explore them. Click on them, you get the full details. So there's 200 and something PowerPoint files there, which you can now sort of explore in this sort of interface. And all that processing is documented within the notebook. So I got out all the unique domain names, and I tried to create these circular dendrograms, which if you zoom in on them really close, they actually have the text of the domain names. but to actually sort of see them on a screen, you have to zoom out so much that they just become these sorts of spiky balls things. So it was a bit of a failure in terms of visualization, but on the other hand, they do look sort of cool. And they look cool on a t-shirt. In fact, oh, I got my t-shirt. Here I am modeling. There you go. So that's the whole of the gov.au domain on a t-shirt for you, which you can order from Redbubble if you want to. This is the commercial part of the presentation. Yeah, so even though as a visualization, it was a bit of a failure because you can't really practically zoom in on it, it is quite an interesting representation of the gov.au domain. And like I say, an example that some of these techniques can be scaled up if you need them to be. So that's a question of starting to explore change over time. So there are a number of examples within that of looking how web pages change. One way of doing it is to look at, so take a particular web page and just look at all of the captures and see how one capture differs from another. And that's what this notebook does. Now, this is interesting. You might notice here, excuse me, that the link down here says run live in app mode on Binder. What does that app mode mean? App mode is an extension for Jupyter. And it means that instead of actually seeing the notebook, as we saw that one before with the code and all the text and everything, actually hides all the code cells and runs everything automatically when you load it. What this means in effect is that it turns the notebook into a web application. So you can create something using a notebook which somebody can use without worrying about the code at all. They can just dive in, have little widgets that they use, they can start doing things, use it as a tool rather than think too much about the code that's sitting underneath. So let's see it. Where is it? Here it is. So this is a Jupyter notebook, right? And you can actually see it. If you click on that link, it'll actually open it up with all the code and everything. So you can see it and you can edit it like any other Jupyter notebook. But the default view through app mode is this. It just looks like a web app. So let's use an example. So here's the who can travel to Canada COVID advice page. I'm just going to grab that URL. I'm going to paste it in here. You can see you can choose the archive that you want to use. In this case, of course, we'll use the Internet Archive and we'll just click on Show Text Changes. So it's again, it's going to get a time map. It's going to get a list of all of the captures of that page. And then it's going to start with the first one, and then it's going to compare each capture with its predecessor. So you can see how things change between captures. So we can see it's the start, nothing much is changing, but then all of a sudden between the 3rd and 4th of April, we have significant changes to the page. What we're comparing here is both the sort of, includes the sort of menus and navigation stuff within the web page. Because in this context, it can be quite useful to see how those structures are changing as well as the actual content. So this will just keep going. So obviously there were major changes at that point in April where the whole pages were reorganized. Then we see this sort of more subtle changes over time. Interesting changes in language. So between the 16th and 17th of April, we went from mandatory isolation for travelers entering Canada to mandatory quarantine for travelers entering Canada. So this is just going to continue on, like I say, looking at each capture and its predecessor to see what has changed. Now, as well as being an app, so running in app mode like this, this page, this notebook, also can be fed parameters to start it off. So once we get to the end of this, once it gets through all of the captures, it'll actually generate a URL which you can share. And if you share that URL, not only does it automatically open this notebook up in Binder, but it has the parameters, so the Internet Archive and the URL embedded within that URL, so that it just starts this analysis automatically. So you can share that with somebody and say, hey, look how this web page changes over time. And it'll load up and it'll run and they'll start to see that comparison straight away. So that's pretty cool. We'll just let that go and we'll check back on that later. So this is the notebook that we're running. Other ways of exploring change over time. So there are a couple of notebooks which use screenshots or generate full page screenshots of this sort. One enables you to grab sort of screenshots every year over a period of time to see how a website changes. It's really, I quite like having, I like having this full page screenshots because you get that interesting from a web design point of view, because you see where, you know, we stopped worrying about the fold in web pages and just sort of went for it in terms of really long web pages. I should say that the screenshotting stuff can be a little bit flaky. There's a sort of lot that has to happen there in terms of spinning up a headless browser and things like that to grab the web page. It will work most of the time. If it doesn't work the first time, just try it again. For some reason, sometimes it doesn't work the first time you do it, but then the next it works. So I don't really know. But it will run on Binder, so you can just spin it up again on Binder and go in and start generating these sort of full page screenshots. It is entirely possible. Other ways of exploring change over time. So another thing, okay, you know, the questions that a historian might ask, for example, of a web archive, is when does a particular piece of text first appear in a web page? You know, it's a pretty sort of standard question, but it's one which is actually not terribly easy to answer, you know, from a typical web archive interface. This tool does just that. So you give it a piece of text, you give it a URL, you tell it what repository you want to search in, and then you can ask it either to show you the first occurrence, so show you where it first occurs, or you can get it to show you when it last occurs, so where it disappears from a web page. Or you can just get it to show you all the occurrences of that particular text fragment. So if you ask it to show the first occurrence, then obviously it starts at the first capture, and it goes through each capture in turn until it finds that piece of text and it displays the result. If you ask for the last occurrence, obviously it starts the last capture and goes backwards in time until it finds it. If you ask for all occurrences, it just shows everything. And then at the end of it, it creates a little visualization to show you how those occurrences vary over time. There it is there. So again, this runs in app mode, as you can see, so as a web app. So again, you know, part of the idea here is that, you know, we're providing things for a range of users. As I said, with the GLAM Workbench, people are going to arrive at it at different points on their pathway through these things. So somebody, you know, a historian who's got absolutely no interest in the sort of data as data, but just wants to ask historical questions of web archives, can just use a tool like this without thinking too much about, you know, the differences in Memento implementations or anything like that. They can actually just, you know, ask a question and find an answer. You know, it may be that from that they want to understand more about what's going on under the hood. You know, how is it getting this? You know, and that's when they can sort of open up the notebook, the code underneath the notebook, and if I want to start to, you know, modify it or you know, get a good understanding of what's happening underneath in terms of the data. So you provide those sorts of pathways for people, a tool that they can just start using, but also the option to actually see what's going on underneath, to modify it, to develop alternative ways of viewing. Okay, so I just want to leave some time for questions here. We might just, I'll just say though that you can, within the GLAM Workbench, you'll see the link at the top of the page goes to the GitHub repository for the Web Archive section. So it's all there in GitHub. You can, if you have any problems, if you have any suggestions, you can jump into the issue section and add something there. That would be very welcome. So that's it there. We'll just check in on a couple of these things to see how they're going. So this was the harvesting text from the DFAT. And let's see. Okay, it's still going. So this is another example. So again, these are all different, the text files here, a more complex metadata file where we've got, oh, we've still only got one capture, but it's got different, yeah. So this is just, we'll just obviously just keep chugging away and we'll eventually generate quite a lot of data. And in fact, I might just stop that now that it's, I'll just see where we're up to. So it's got, I mean, there are 272 matching URLs. So it's just working its way through, and you can see each of those, the number of captures of each of that URL. So in that case, there's 30 captures of that URL. In that one, there's only one. But it's getting the text out of each capture of each URL. And our other little thing which has been running here. So this is the Canadian travel advice. It's still going. What are we up to? Let's see what we're up to. Oh, we're still only up to July. But again, it's interesting to see how language changes, isn't it? So any person who has been approved to some people who have been approved to become a permanent resident, change from the 30th to 30th of July. So that's still going along. We might not get to the end of that before the end of our session, but as I said, once it does get to the end, it generates a shareable URL, which will take you to that view of the page. Okay. I might wrap things up there. Please feel free to ping me on Twitter. I'm Rag on Twitter. And to use the GLAM Workbench hashtag if you're interested or doing stuff with it. If you are, particularly if you're using it, because it's a bit hard, sometimes to see what people are doing and how they're using it. So if you can add the hashtag, that would be really useful. But I don't think I've got any specific questions in the chat there. I might hand back to Corey if you.
Hey, Tim. Wow, that was so cool. I can see now why Nick recommended that so highly. There's something kind of subversive about the tools too, just being able to, when you're looking at these kind of government websites and the changes over time. It's really, the thing for me that I tend to think, and I think many of my colleagues are the same way, we tend to think of web archives as these discrete sets of documents, and the ability to interrogate them across time and space is really empowering. So it's just wonderful to see that. I've got some stuff chugging along here in my browser about the first occurrence of the word COVID on CNN. It's just really, really interesting stuff, really engaging stuff. So yeah, we have a few minutes left, folks. Does anyone have any comments or questions? Just use the chat. And again, Tim, I apologize for the late time of day for most of our colleagues in the Eastern time zone here. So they're probably getting a little bit hungry for dinner anyway.
That's fine. And as I said, look, yeah, welcome to ping me on Twitter if you've got any questions to follow up. But
yeah.
Also, if you do have suggestions, to drop them in the GitHub issues there. This is, this is a great project to work on in that, as I said before, I learned so much in doing it, and I was able to work with, Andy Jackson at the British Library and things like that. Yeah. But it was quite limited. So, you know, there's so much more we could be doing. And particularly, you know, not, I mean, as I said, you're going to hear from the Archives Unleashed people shortly. And, you know, they do amazing stuff. But, you know, I think there is space for those sort of little entry point things where, like I said, you know, a historian who doesn't want to actually think about web archives too much, but does want to be able to treat them like historical sources, can actually start to ask, you know, questions of them. So, you know, those sorts of possibilities, I think I'm really interested in exploring.
Yeah, and even just being able to really quickly engage people with the power of these types of tools across web archives, I think is really, I mean, that's what I'm really taking away from this is just a really quick way to show just the power of this type of thing.
Yeah, like I say,
impressive.
it's that sort of why question. So,
Yeah.
you know, why should somebody be interested in the fact that you've got a web archive, that you've been preserving all this data over time? You know, what's in it for them?
Yeah.
You know, if you can start to sort of demonstrate the types of things that they can do without, you know, a lot of special equipment or a lot of, you know, without having to learn a whole lot of coding or anything like that, then I think, you know, you're creating those opportunities for engagement which weren't there before.
Yeah.
Oh, we've got a question.
Yeah. Tim, so yeah, thinking specifically about students who would do well to learn,
Yeah.
how would you introduce students to it? Historical method courses, one-off workshops?
Yeah, look, I don't have a good answer to that because I'm still sort of exploring some of those possibilities myself. I mean, I mean, ultimately, I think my answer would be yes, the historical methods courses. So, you know, I just as a historian who's sort of fallen into this digital stuff and sometimes, you know, describes himself as a digital humanities person, but, you know, I want to see this sort of stuff integrated into history courses. You know, that's my ultimate aim. So that it should be, you know, in those sort of courses where they might sort of learn about physical archives and using physical archives, or you know, examining the context of a document or anything like that, where they're doing those sorts of basic historiographical stuff. You know, web archive should be an example there, as well as you know, government documents or something like that. You know, it should just be part of, you know, these, as a historian, particularly if you're going to be looking at the, you know, 1990s or beyond, you need to have some understanding of web archives and the sorts of questions you can ask of them, the limitations there may be, you know. So yeah, I think in the short term, you know, obviously having workshops where you can raise awareness and get people thinking about it and starting to work on it, I think is useful. And obviously, you know, I give quite a few workshops and things. But ultimately, yeah, I think it just needs to be built into historical training. You know, ideally at an undergraduate level, but certainly at a postgraduate level. I mean, to me, it's just, you know, a no-brainer.
Yeah.
This sort of stuff just should be part of postgraduate training in history.
Well, Tim, I want to be respectful of your time and everyone else's too. And again, on behalf of the Canadian Web Archiving community here in Canada, thank you so much for spending this time with us, and really appreciate it. Very exciting tools. I think you've given us a lot to think about, and I look forward to hearing where these things go over time. And again, just thank you so much for joining us today.
No worries. It's been a pleasure. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, take care, everybody. Bye now.
Bye.